The government is trying to control our freaking minds, man. Sounds crazy, right? Well, the funny thing is, at one point, it actually wasn't. It was, in fact, very real. Let's get in to MKUltra. Project MKUltra was a secret government program started by the United States in the 1950s by the Central Intelligence Agency, also known as the CIA. You see, as US POWs were coming back from the Korean War, this right here was the midst of the Red Scare. It was the height of communist propaganda, and reports were starting to come out that the Chinese and the Russians were using absolutely terrible methods to extract information from soldiers. Or even worse, that they were using techniques to turn people into sleeper agents that were going to infiltrate government and civilian life to wreak havoc upon the United States. With some of these methods involving the use of mind-altering drugs in order to achieve their results. And so because of these reports, the CIA begins to investigate the potential of these substances and their use back in the 1950s. And it really was ironic in an extremely dark way. Because just a few days after claiming that this sort of non-consensual experiment, even on one's enemies, is antithetical to American values, then CIA Director Alan Dulles approved the funding and operation of what would be known as Project MKUltra. With its aim being at creating mind control techniques as well as finding the best way to break someone's mind for information, the project then spent the better part of the next 20 years working unchecked. Well, with a project so big, how are they actually going to keep any of it secret? Well, here's how. What the CIA did essentially was create a massive series of shell companies that would allow them to funnel money. In addition to that, by donating resources towards reputable organizations, they would be able to disguise their intention. With some of these organizations being universities, as over 80 of them were actually involved in the project. Many of the researchers, doctors, scientists, etc. had no idea that they were extracting information from patients and handing it over to the CIA. And concerning the subject matter of what it is that they were going to be doing, it's natural to assume that there were going to be some concerns. But when those concerns initially arose about what would happen if the public found out that some of the experiments were being conducted on Canadian citizens, one CIA official was reported to have said, "Who cares? They're Canadian." Over time, the scope of the project would gradually begin to expand, including American citizens as well as even Danish ones. Initially starting with a focus on hypnosis, the project quickly turned into administering various psychoactive drugs, things such as LSD, alcohol, heroin, morphine, mescaline, psilocybin, scopolamine, and even sodium pentothal, commonly known as truth serum, which was used by spies and interrogators. And all of this was the brainchild of this man, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Now, Gottlieb was an absolutely brilliant chemist, and he was responsible for the creation of the majority of the programs that went under the umbrella of these 149 different tests that were done with MKUltra. Mind you, the guy was essentially something like a mad scientist. I mean, he was the guy who tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, or one of the people responsible for it, by sending him poisoned gifts repeatedly. It also didn't help that he was a frequent user of LSD himself, and so he devoted a large section of the project's funding towards seeing what LSD's effect on humans would be. Now, at first, it was harmless enough, with the CIA agents and scientists dosing themselves first and then recording its effects. Which might have been okay if it wasn't for the fact that this fairly quickly transitioned into them secretly drugging their colleagues and then reporting those effects while they were unaware. As you might have gotten an idea of, and you will understand further from this video, the CIA had a little bit of a problem with obtaining informed consent from people. I mean, in the spirits of being true bastards, the CIA also funded a project called Operation Midnight Climax, which just sounds like a really cheesy movie out of the 80s that you probably would not have been allowed to see as a kid. But in comparison to that movie, it probably had even less use and was more frustrating to make and operate than anything else. In a parallel to the Nazi brothel Salon Kitty, which, mind you, I mentioned in a podcast episode that I just did recently, this particular experiment involved bugging and monitoring prostitutes and their johns with both audio bugging equipment and a two-way mirror in a specially designed apartment known as a safe house. And the guy who was in charge of this project was a former Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent by the name of George White. Now, he had a number of safe houses that were set up in San Francisco as well as New York City, and had a little bit of a voyeuristic streak himself. You see, he would personally supervise each one of the encounters while sitting on the other side of a two-way mirror on a portable toilet. And yes, you heard me right, a portable toilet. And what was the purpose of this, you might wonder? Well, what he had done was hire prostitutes to dose their customers with LSD and then secretly record the results. The goal of which was to find out the best way that you could set up a honey trap in order to be able to extract information from a target. You know, this being done through sexually infused blackmail. The fact that White got to view everything while all the sexy time was happening was just a, perk of the job for him. And in the end, after all the studies, after all the reports, after everything that they did, they came to the conclusion that the easiest way to extract truthful information from a man was to do it within the first 15 minutes post-coitus. Which just beggars the question of why they would do this, because you could ask any housewife in all of history the same question, and they would have answered it without any study whatsoever. All of it in the end just seemed kind of pointless, and White would go on to host hedonistic parties in these safe houses. When a subordinate of White was later questioned, he stated, "He only seemed to ask me to help him get laid. He didn't really care about anything else." But he wasn't the only one that was getting screwed over. At one point, you had this young promising army commander who was unknowingly dosed by his own supervisor, who, if you can guess from the previous story that I've told in here, happened to be Mr. White. Olson had never in fact taken LSD before, and it was the CIA's standard practice at the time to give people way too much LSD in the first place. You didn't start off small, you went big, and that's what you could see the most results from. Olson had been mentioning to his wife that he really couldn't handle things at work anymore, that it was really starting to get to him. But of course, because of the nature of his work and what it is that he did, he couldn't exactly talk to her about it. Likely because the work that he ended up doing was a mockery of what he thought that he was going to be doing working for the government. He was regularly being flown to other parts of the world to either create or administer different kind of drug concoctions to give to people during interrogations in order to try and extract information from them. He would then, of course, have to stick around and see the results of his handiwork. And this was really starting to wear on him. It was rumored at the time that Olson was very close to blowing the whistle on the entire project and just revealing it all to the public. In fact, one of his colleagues warned him that he needed to tread lightly on the subject matter. Olson slipped into a deep depression, and 9 days later he fell to his death from the 10th story of a New York hotel building. But did he actually fall? Some of the reports say that the coroner noted that Olson suffered no lacerations on his arms or face from diving face first through the glass, and that he had what appeared to be a wound to the side of his head that had existed prior to his death, implying that his impromptu swan dive was not actually his choice after all. But if he had actually gone public with a number of the things, would it have even actually mattered? As far as Operation Midnight Climax was concerned, the CIA did not think that anyone was actually going to be able to go to the police or anyone else and tell their story and be believed. I mean, think about it. It's an absolutely insane tale in the first place. Who would outright just believe that? It was claimed by one CIA official that the people that they were using as test subjects simply would not be able to fight back. But of course, you can't be too careful, and this is why certain groups of people were used more often, because they posed less of a risk. Prison inmates would be promised special privileges or a lesser sentence for whatever they had been charged with. Mental asylum patients were also used because, after all, who is going to believe a crazy person in court? Their word simply was not going to be applicable as a credible witness. In some of these experiments, patients were dosed with LSD up to 77 days in a row. Which leads me to one of the more disturbing parts of the story: the Allen Memorial Institute and the sleep room experiments. The Allen Memorial Institute was located at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. It was, at one time, a highly respected institution. Led by a man by the name of Donald Ewan Cameron, some of the most harrowing experiments occurred at the Allen Institute under his watch. You see, Cameron was known to be an authoritarian and was a master emotional manipulator. He would bully or coerce patients into compliance, and he thought that he could cure schizophrenia all on his own using various controversial methods. In what became known as the sleep room, Cameron oversaw a treatment called psychic diving, something that he had pioneered himself. This involved playing repeated messages to someone while physically incapacitated. Sometimes this was attained by placing patients into an insulin coma. Other times they would give a patient a barbiturate. But once paralyzed and unable to move or object, the subject would be forced to listen to repeated audio message tailored to their specific case and/or trauma. These messages would be played over and over and over and over again, sometimes up to 500,000 times. In fact, there were some cases of some of these subjects being drugged for over 90 days in these induced comas. But then the story gets even more bizarre when the patients would move on to the next stage that Cameron would call depatterning. You see, depatterning involves drugging a patient, and then once the patient is drugged, they are subjected to electrical shock therapy that is 40 times greater than the standard dosage. And this would be done to them 3 to 4 times per day. Mind you, the way that electrical shock therapy worked is that you were supposed to be shocked one time at the much lower dosage, and this was done once with a week in between each treatment. And they were doing this 3 to 4 times a day at 40 times the voltage. So tragically, as you can expect, the patients that were subjected to this had their brains basically fry. This would leave them with various consequences such as incontinence, amnesia, forgetting how to talk, forgetting their parents, sometimes even thinking that the interrogators were actually their parents. Many of the people who were subjected to these experiments simply had their lives completely destroyed. Some of the patients of the project included later celebrities such as the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, and the famous crime boss Whitley Bulger, who willingly volunteered in exchange for a shortened sentence. Again, I have to state that the majority of the patients who were involved with these experiments were given absolutely no form of informed consent prior to these tests. You would have to write an email to NASA to try to calculate the sheer amount of damage that was done to their brains. It's just simply incalculable. And so at this point, you're probably then wondering, well, were they ever caught? Was there ever justice? Was anything ever really resolved? Well, for years, the resounding answer was no. For decades, absolutely nothing happened. But then in the mid-1980s, you had a former group of patients get together and sue the US government, who promptly settled out of court. What they got in the end was $91,000 US, which, if you adjust for inflation, is around $500,000 today. So can you really call that justice? Well, considering the fact that the CIA for 30 years refused to admit any kind of wrongdoing whatsoever, the fact that they settled out of court would in turn be kind of an admission of guilt. And mind you, from the CIA, that's a pretty rare thing. And I'm sure that for those that received payment, it did do something that for the remainder of their lives did at least improve the quality of it, even if their previous 30-odd years had been completely ruined. Perhaps the reason that they were able to settle at all is because of the small number of people that actually did so. The majority never had their cases even able to go to court. They died long before. Gottlieb, White, and all the other members of the CIA who conducted these experiments, they never saw a single ounce of jail time. But ironically, because of the way that this project was conducted, it actually ended up backfiring on the CIA and the United States in general. Because many of the subjects were college-age young adults, they shared their experience with LSD to others, and within a decade, it became the drug of choice for the 60s counterculture movement. So while the government had started out seeking how to close, manipulate, and destroy minds, they ended up opening so many more to another path that would change our world forever. And if you would like to hear about some of the other experiments that were done as part of MKUltra or other projects, then please do let us know down in the comments below. This has been Secrecy with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel, and I do hope that you enjoyed the episode. Again, please let me know down in the comments below what it is that we should do next, and I will see you all here next time. Thank you, and goodbye.